Greetings! You're listening to the Department of Defense Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation podcast series Part 2, Military Herpetofaunal Project Highlights and Successes. The purpose of this podcast series is to feature the people, projects, and military installations that are conducting exceptional amphibian and reptile conservation, management, and research projects on DoD lands. In this episode, Eglin Air Force biologist Rodney Felix and Virginia Tech Project Coordinator Kelly Jones discuss the Reticulated Flatwoods Salamander project at Eglin Air Force Base. We hope you enjoyed the podcast.
All right, Rodney, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Go ahead and please just introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your roles here at Eglin Air Force Base.
I'm Rodney Felix, endangered species biologist, and I'm in the Eglin Natural Resources Office, and the Reticulated Flatwoods Salamander falls within my purview within the wildlife section.
And I'm Kelly Jones, and I work for Virginia Tech, and we are in a cooperative relationship with Eglin Air Force Base, and work closely with their Natural Resources branch. And I'm the field coordinator for Virginia Tech's team on the ground. And we've been working on flatwood salamanders the entire time that I've been here since 2007. And so that's been a major focal species for the work that we do together.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So let's go ahead and just jump right in and start with our first question here. So what amphibian or reptile project would you guys like to highlight to the DoD Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, or PARC network?
Well, the management and monitoring of reticulated flatwood salamander, Ambystoma bishopi, here on Eglin Air Force Base. I'm a little bit biased, and I like to say that it is probably the most critically endangered terrestrial species we've got on Eglin.
Great. Can you guys tell us a little more about the purpose or the objective of the projects you guys are doing here?
The goal of our office, Natural Resources Office, is to basically get to the point of recovery with the salamander that meets what some of us in conservation biology will call the 3 R's framework, getting the species populations to the point where they are resilient, where they are represented across the landscape, and where they are redundant. So the goal is to get to that point where the species will become delisted, and at that point of delisting, the regulatory burden is almost entirely removed from the Air Force as the land manager. So yeah, our goal is to add mission flexibility by ensuring the health and abundance of this species.
Okay, and so that sounds like it could be a pretty extensive process. How long has this project been going on?
When we were coming over here, Kelly and I talked about that for a little bit, and it's started in the 90s with some surveying and early monitoring before Virginia Tech and Eglin started cooperating on management for the species, which was in 2003, and Kelly should take it from there.
So basically, when Virginia Tech came on, we basically came in and there hadn't been a lot of ongoing monitoring of these salamanders. So basically, I wasn't there in 2003. I didn't come in until 2007, but basically our work began on the shoulders of the people who had done a lot of the initial survey work in the 90s. And so really what we're looking at is today we're looking back at essentially just over 2 decades of work that Virginia Tech has been involved in, working together with Eglin and a number of other partners that we may get into later. But The first decade was primarily represented by essentially monitoring, doing a lot more surveys into areas that hadn't been as explored in the 90s. Basically to kind of reestablish a baseline. What does Eglin still have? How are they doing across years? Are they stable? Are they increasing? Are they declining? Are there pockets of animals in areas that people didn't know? So there was a lot of exploratory work. There was also some research money that was brought in through grants and such to come alongside the Eglin contract to start working out filling in some of the knowledge gaps on the animal's life history. And there were some things that were in the literature that basically contradictory and things that just hadn't been settled. And to know how to effectively manage something, it really helps the more you understand essentially what it does at what times of year and what matters, what affects survival and reproductive output and all that kind of stuff and dispersal. And so that was kind of the main focus for that first decade. And then going into the second decade, towards the end of the first, we started doing our first experimental habitat management in some of the wetlands through some funding that came in through the state, because there's some shared common goals between the state and the Air Force as far as natural resources go. And so coming into the second decade, we basically were a few years into kind of tracking the effects of those experimental management actions in those breeding wetlands. And then once we started seeing what worked, what wasn't, what we hadn't really done well with those, we made some adjustments, and then we started heading into a period of more active management. And the whole while we're still collecting, we're still monitoring these populations and seeing how they're doing, how they're responding. And that feedback loop allowed us to make adjustments over the course of the past decade. And in just the past few years, we can talk about this later, but we started getting into actual, instead of just working with habitat, we started working with the animals as well.
So talk to me more about what are some of the results or the outcomes that you guys are seeing?
Over the years, we've seen, we've detected additional populations, additional actively breeding wetlands that on Eglin anyway expanded the range. We can elaborate more on that later. The habitat has been visibly changing in this time to where we think that the structure, the compositions are getting closer to what we believe is or would be the reference condition. Really, that's one of the challenges of working with this species is that it's endangered almost wholly because its habitats of thousands of years ago are all gone or altered. And so we don't really know what it looked like when these things were probably more abundant and widespread, decades, if not centuries ago. So we're seeing habitat being improved and restored over the last several years. It notably since in the time since Virginia Tech has been involved with Eglin, and also our state partners in funding some of the habitat restoration that we've been able to accomplish. But so yeah, we could see the habitat changing. We could see the populations growing, like the abundance, a local abundance within a pond. We can detect that changing for better or worse. And lately it's in many locations, it's for the better. And we've seen more of those breeding wetlands do the same thing, where they have fluctuated but are on the positive trend for right now. But we got to the habitat to the point where we thought it was something closer to reference than anything we have on Eglin. And we took advantage of that condition that was believed to be unoccupied for the last several years. Kelly,
between 10 and 15 years of annually surveyed sites and all the sites adjacent to them.
And the folks on the ground had the survey and monitoring effort for most people to think that this was an unoccupied area. And we put, beginning 3 years ago, we started relocating animals from some ponds into these unoccupied ponds and wetlands, and thinking that if anywhere these were going to be the candidates for where this could work. And after 3 years of some persisting year, like each year when we put animals in, we detected them for several days, several times during the breeding season. So they were, at least for us, persisting within that season. But last year, it was the winter season of 2022-23, we had adults come back. And we could go into the life cycle perhaps later, but having an adult come back and not detecting a larva or what we call a metamorph, which is the larva progressing to adulthood and leaving the pond, the evidence strongly suggested that this was survival from one season to the next season, the following year. So that is the probably the most notable outcome we've had, or result we've had, certainly since I've been here.
And then once the wetland, we did some egg searching, didn't find anything, but then when the wetlands filled, then we actually detected that basically we were able to confirm that breeding had actually occurred at both.
Yeah. So there you go. You've got them surviving for several weeks when we put them there. Then they survived to a year, and not only did they survive to a year, but it has now the potential to actually hold as a population if they're breeding.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to go down a different road here. Let's talk a little bit about how this project is supporting maybe the mission and the military readiness on this installation. Has this project helped delist or reverse any declines with the species? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, it's too early with this species and where we are to understand where it's at in terms of delisting or downlisting. But we do feel that it's a more secure population on Eglin across the areas in which it breeds. And it's now, barring what we call stochastic events, these are just random weather events, for example, everything's in place for the species to hold on and probably grow on Eglin. So with a more stable outlook on this species on Eglin means that it's only going to ease burdens on the mission as it continues to grow. It can sound counterintuitive to have an endangered species as federally listed out there in the training and testing environment. And yes, the Air Force as a federal agency has to comply with terms and conditions of the Endangered Species Act. But that act does allow room for progress towards recovery for a species to have a positive effect on that regulatory burden. And we've seen that with this species exactly, with an agreement that Eglin has been able to enter with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's under the Endangered Species Act, Section A1, where according to the management goals and objectives Eglin has put out, and with which the Fish and Wildlife Service agrees, we have this. I think this is what 2018. The regulatory burden was removed from all potential breeding ponds or breeding wetlands where we were not sure of the occurrence of reticulated flatwoods salamanders. They're unknown occupied. They're probably not occupied, but they just haven't been detected as many times as they've been surveyed. Well, up to 2018, we had to treat those as if they were occupied. Eglin had to consider those as occupied wetlands under the Endangered Species Act and engage with the service accordingly. For a few reasons, based mostly on the commitments to management from Eglin and the Air Force, we now only have those burdens on areas where we know for sure the salamander occurs and is breeding. And it's a narrower scale than what we were previously dealing with. Almost hand in hand with that agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service was a Department of Defense commitment to manage the species off of the site as well. At Escorbano Point Wildlife Management Area, just to the west of Eglin, and actually abutting Eglin on the western side of the reservation, there are also these salamanders, and Department of Defense and Eglin that have provided funds for kind of this off-site management project, and that effort to learn more about how they're doing off of federal property and to encourage the recovery off of federal property has had a large part in the service deciding to reduce that burden on the Eglin installation.
All right. So are there any other stakeholders or benefits beyond the military lands that this was conducted on?
There's a whole community of or network of stakeholders that have an interest and a responsibility along with the U.S. Air Force, for managing this species towards recovery. And one of the strengths of our project has actually been all the partnerships that we've been able to form with so many of them. And that's brought in additional funding opportunities. It's brought in extra expertise. There's some really, we're proud of the work we do here, and we've learned a lot as individuals and as local organizations, but there have been some really talented people in that network that have basically made some discoveries, come up with some really good insights that they've shared with us, which has accelerated our learning curve, and in turn we've been able to do the same thing with them. And Eglin has done a really good job and Rodney has been a big part of this in the years that he's been working on this project, of maintaining a good relationship, good communication with the regulators, getting their support. We've built a lot of trust with them, so they've basically really appreciated how we've made their job easier. Eglin is basically it's not an adversarial relationship. It's been a really productive one, and Eglin has also been willing to try things in the face of unknowns, and a lot of that has really paid off because they weren't stabs in the dark, but we didn't really know exactly what would happen until we tried it.
Well, and they came from within this cooperative environment with these other stakeholders. And I would like to underscore that it's some of these stakeholders are putting funds, significant amounts of funds toward habitat restoration. Just the primary example that I think that as long as we at Eglin are thinking not just of keeping the species stable and just doing what keeps kind of keeps the mission going and the regulators satisfied. This additional funding allows us to go beyond that. Without it, there's no way that Eglin or anywhere else, I think, without extramural funding, can push towards recovery and actually downlisting and delisting a species. These are expensive projects, and it's not happening with just full internal funding.
So I'm sure this hasn't been, the easiest process. Can you describe any challenges you've encountered and, how you may have overcame those challenges?
It starts, the challenge starts in the landscape. This is a salamander that occupies what we call flatwoods, and the flatwoods in this part of the state are relatively constrained. And on Eglin, they're relatively constrained as well. I think we've got just a fraction of the overall installation size is actual flatwoods, and then therefore where the potential habitat for the species occurs. It's in areas that generally are the closest to the public, anywhere on Eglin. And so some desirable management practices become less desirable because of that, and just more difficult, more challenging to use. Like prescribed fire can be a very effective tool for managing the vegetation, to those states we think are reference, like I mentioned at the outset of the podcast. And so we don't have that luxury of doing that anytime, anywhere, whenever we'd like to do it. So we still can, but under ideal conditions, they're very much reduced across seasons. So that means we're going to be doing more old-fashioned types of things, putting in the work, going out, walking around these habitats with equipment in hand, and cutting and hauling vegetation, and doing it that way, which is just a different scale of effort.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it sounds like there's been, so much time and effort put into this. And Kelly, you mentioned numerous great opportunities. Can you both tell me more about what the most exciting or, interesting things you found as a result of this?
That's a great question. Well, I guess the main thing I'd say is when we started, there's debate over, any individual species, whether it's really warranted to be on the Endangered Species Act or ones that aren't listed, whether they are, whether they should be. In this case, everything that we know about this points to a precipitous decline that was the trajectory when we all started. And it would probably be not far-fetched to think that this animal would have gone extinct in our lifetimes. There's a very good chance that would have been the case had the status quo been maintained. And big picture, we've basically been able to at least get proof of concept, if not solidly demonstrate that there is hope for full species recovery with this, that it can be done in a way that's compatible with the military mission, absolutely without impinging on their activities, and basically now it's just a matter of swinging through. So I don't want to. We're kind of getting short on time, so I'd like Rodney to have a chance to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, of course, documenting the breeding after translocation was probably a singular exciting event for me. What excites me most, to say it simply, is that if you could come up with the resources and put the right people and enough people and the resources together, maybe for more species than just this one, recovery is it is a reality. We should remain optimistic when we deal with this species or others on other military installations. It's expensive, but it can happen. You can get that goal of species recovery, and to a lesser extent, I'm excited about seeing how the Eglin salamander management has become a lab, if you will, of methods and materials and thought. And we're seeing progress here that looks to translate soon off of Eglin, which would only increase the likelihood of recovery. The recovery of the species is depending on more than just what happens at Eglin. Make no mistake, but we're going to play a strong role in that.
Great. This has been so insightful. Thank you, Rodney and Kelly, so much for sitting down with me today. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's our pleasure.